All right, we good now?
Yep.
Cool. All right, welcome everyone. There we go. Yeah, so we miss you all. We can't
We
wait
do.
till we are safe to be in person again and meeting in the basement of a bank at Turing School once more someday once we're all vaccinated. But we're really happy to keep doing this. Thank you all for tuning in live. This is fantastic to see everyone here. I mean, every social interaction I can get is like super welcome, and I'm an introvert. Just it's nice to see people um, at even an online event. Our sponsors are Zoom. Zoom has been supporting this meetup. Actually, they dropped the big sponsorship on us right before everything went crazy, and turns out they also have this tool that helps enable our meetup happening remotely. So that's been very fortunate. Salt has supported us with our meetup fees, and we have a special sponsor this meetup, Wallaby. And let me read something for this. So I have not gotten to use Wallaby myself, but Wallaby creates awesome software developer productivity tools that run your JavaScript and TypeScript code immediately as you type, highlighting results in your IDE next to your code. For more information about their products, please visit their websites, wallabyjs.com and quackajs.com. I'll throw links in the chat in a few minutes. Cool thing about them, I actually have a license for my team. I've been meaning to try it. And two developers I greatly respect have been recommended it highly. So definitely take a look at their tools. And I've got some licenses to give out. So I'm also going to drop a link after the talk gets going. Go to that link and enter the raffle for a license to Wallaby.js and Quokka.js. Slides. Cool. And as always, thank you to our Open Collective supporters. We run all of our finances on Open Collective, and we take donations. Feel free to support us. There's a link off our main website, reactdenver.com. And yeah, it's really awesome, all the support we've gotten from the community. And with that, who's hiring in the community? Please feel free to post in the chat or post directly to the meetup.com page. That is absolutely encouraged and welcome. We'd love to hear who has an opening. Also, if you're looking to be hired, feel free to post in either place as well. I recommend throwing like a link to your LinkedIn or your website or wherever you can download your resume. A little intro is always great. And after the talks, we can always stick around and chat. That's also a good time to get to know each other. Announcements. Does anybody have any announcements? Feel free to speak up or throw it directly in the chat right now. Is there anything in the chat right now? Or are we good?
Let's see, no direct announcements.
Okay. Feel free to throw something there in a minute. I'll jump into one that I have. So we would like to invite members to our organizing team. We have had about 4 or 5 of us organizing this meetup for a few years now, and it has been fantastic to have multiple people running this and helping to organize this and work with the community and helping find new speakers and all of that. It's definitely a team sport for us. Makes it so we can take nights off, take breaks, move places or have kids or whatever it is. We've got some of those things going on right now. We're looking ahead at this year, and first, this invitation applies to everyone, but second, in particular, we'd really like to encourage anyone who identifies as underrepresented in tech. We believe it makes a significant difference having a diverse organizing team to help others in the community who feel underrepresented feel like they can participate in the community. Of course, again, everyone is welcome, but extra encouragement to anyone who feels unique when they look around the room.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just to add on that a little bit, couldn't agree more with what Will said. And I want to keep in mind that it is our expectation to someday go back to doing in-person events. And hopefully that means this year we can do that. And that even more so requires a team effort for us. And all that's to say is that there are many ways to get involved. Even if, once we do move back to the live events in person, Will's based in Longmont. Some people are out of town and still find plenty of ways to help. So If you're not sure if you could make an impact, or if you're not sure that you can really commit much time to helping us, that's okay. Just feel free to reach out to Will and I, and we'd be happy to, to try to guide you in one direction or another there, because we certainly do need the help and would appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. Exactly. And I'd also like to plug this not only for organizing, but speaking as well. It makes a difference in our membership when our speaker lineup is diverse. Related to that, I'd like to share an announcement about Global Diversity CFP Day. So CFP stands for Call for Proposals, essentially how conferences get speakers, besides the ones they know about, new people to come to their conference and share ideas. It's coming up this month, next week. I forget, actually, where's it? No, it's a Saturday. It's a Saturday, January 23rd. GlobalDiversityCFPDay.com. Again, I'll drop the link in the chat. But GlobalDiversityCFPDay.com is a workshop for people who feel underrepresented or marginalized in tech. And this is to help bring greater diversity to conferences, much along the same lines I was saying around organizing help and speaking at our meetup. Makes a big impact to the tech community to have that support in place and to bring new faces to the stage. And regarding that, this gives us the perfect, are there any other announcements before I jump into the next part?
None in the chat currently.
Okay, cool. That gives us the perfect segue because Daria, 2 years ago, our speaker tonight, 2 years ago, I don't think Daria had even done a meetup talk before, and she attended Global Diversity CFP Day for the first time. And later that year, she went on to speak at her first conference, Dinosaur.js, right here in Denver, and then Cascadia.js in Seattle. And just last month, she spoke at Reactathon, and next month, she's speaking at JS World. She is a really great speaker. I'm really happy to introduce her. And she has a fantastic talk on state management and reusable code in React. Daria, you good to go?
I am good.
All right.
Let me share my screen. All right. Uh-oh, I misplaced the Zoom. Okay. Cool. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to come speak tonight, Will. I would also just like to plug Global Diversity CFP Day. It was a really great experience, and this year everything is online, and so there's a really great lineup of speakers that you wouldn't necessarily get to hear from if it wasn't online. So I think that's a great opportunity. Also, if you have any questions about like speaking at conferences or just generally want to talk about anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. Twitter is probably the best place. Yeah. Cool. So like Will said, my talk is a brief history and introduction to state management and reusable code in React. My name is Daria. I am a full stack developer at Workday in Boulder. I'm a Boulder native. And every day I work on a React and TypeScript front-end application. And then I also work on a backend service in Kotlin. A little bit about kind of my history. In 2015, I wrote my first React application at a company I was working for at the time. We shipped it in CoffeeScript and ES5. And then in 2016, I started a new job and mostly was doing Angular work for a couple years. And then in 2018, I started at Workday as a React developer. 2019, I switched teams at Workday and started working on a brand new React application. And kind of what I noticed was from 2015, when I first started using React, and then coming back to it 3 years later in 2018, and then even from 2018 to 2019, this is kind of how it felt. Like React seemed completely different. In 2015, the community was pretty small. Everyone had their own little cute little house, and we were trying to figure out how we were going to build a neighborhood or like a community and how all these pieces fit together, and how we were supposed to use React to build like larger applications. And then when I came back to it in 2018, everything was just different. Like there was this huge community, a bustling city, if you will. And even the way that you wrote the actual React code looked completely different to me. So much so that I didn't tell people at my newest job that I had React experience because I was so nervous they'd ask me a question and I would have no idea because I was 3 years out of date and everything had changed. But what I've noticed, and even now that it's 2021, all these years later, the same problems that we were looking at in 2015 in the React community kind of just evolved into best practices now. And even though everything changed how you write the React code and what it actually looks like, the actual framework and ideology underneath was still the same. And so I thought we might be able to understand how best to use React now if we took some time to learn about some of the past iterations. And throughout all these iterations, kind of from my perspective, there's been these two ongoing evolving themes or questions. One is state management. How are you supposed to manage all the state in your application? And the other is code reuse. If React is supposed to be like a component-based library, how are you supposed to share code between those components? Maybe they all need to get to your state management. That's kind of an open question. So I thought it would be fun to kind of just go through like a rough React timeline as I perceive it in my brain and just take a look back through React in time. In 2013 is where it all began. That's when Facebook publicly released React. So React wasn't supposed to be an MVC framework or a model view controller framework. React was supposed to be a library for building composable user interfaces, and it encouraged the creation of reusable UI components, which present data that changes over time. And this is kind of very novel because at the time in 2013, the JS state management ecosystem was really heavily based in this model view controller data flow. Frameworks like Backbone.js and Angular.js were really popular, and they were both MVC frameworks. So in an MVC framework, your data flow looks a little bit something like this. There's usually some controllers there in the middle, but essentially what you've got is your models that hold some sort of data that your application needs to know about. And those models send data to the views, and the views display the data. And what Facebook noticed was that this seems nice, but their more complicated applications started to look a lot more like this. When you have asynchronous data updates, and maybe you have lots of updates coming from different places and they need to update different models, or maybe they need to update the same model, your data flow starts to look like it's going in all directions at the same time. When Facebook released in 2013, instead of going down the model view controller pathway, they introduced this idea of Flux. So Flux was a guide on how to architect and manage unidirectional data flow through an application, which fit really well with React's declarative style. And importantly, Flux wasn't a framework. I don't think it was even a library at the very beginning. It was more so just like an idea that the Facebook team encouraged you to follow to keep your React applications unidirectional. Unlike the MVC pattern, the Flux data flow was supposed to look a little bit more like this, where you have an action, that action gets sent to a dispatcher. The dispatcher updates the store, and the store has all of the data, and the data then updates in the view. The really great thing about Flux was that there was a single dispatcher. So in the MVC paradigm, you might have data being updated from lots of different places, and it could be updating the same piece of data. So you'd have to keep all of those different places in sync so that they know to update the data the same way, so you don't have like different data being sent to the store from different places. In Flux, you have a single dispatcher. So all actions get sent to one place. That single dispatcher decides how it's going to update the store. And you can easily trace your data flow through those actions to the dispatchers, then the store and back to the view. Also in Flux, you were supposed to have multiple stores, one or many, I guess, and each store was supposed to manage a particular domain of state for a piece of an application. Also in 2013, React initially released with Mixins. So Mixins were a pattern for code reuse that you could use in conjunction with Flux. And Mixins were essentially just an object that had a bunch of functions on them. So this is an example of a mixin, and it's literally just an object. It has some functions on them. Those functions have access to the React set state, and they also can declare different React lifecycle methods. So you have access to the React lifecycle hooks, not hooks, sorry, and also the state setting capabilities. And if you wanted to use your mixin, you would just take this object, And when you actually created your React class, you would just pass in any number of mixins that you wanted to use inside of this component. And in this component, you would just call like this dot function of the mixin, and you would just kind of like magically get that capability because the mixin was essentially just getting spread onto your React component. So mixins were pretty cool because you could add mixins to any React component. You could use mixins in mixins, and in your React components, you could use any number of mixins, which might sound a little bit like hooks. So you could kind of compose your functionality in your React components. And like I said, they also had access to React state and lifecycle methods. So they were a little bit more useful than just plain JavaScript functions if you were trying to share code. And that brings us to kind of like the next era of React, as I see it anyway, which is in 2015, there's so many Flux libraries. Like everyone is creating a Flux library because there wasn't one really at the time that everyone was using. So if you wanted to use React and you wanted to use Flux, you had to make your own. And a lot of people were open sourcing the ones that they were working on. And maybe like you couldn't decide which one to use. I think Will told me at one point they were using multiple Flux libraries. So there's just like a lot of Flux happening in 2015. And that's also when Redux starts to come onto the scene. So in 2015, Redux was released, and Redux was kind of like a Flux, but a little bit different and better implementation that was well-defined and opinionated. It was a full feature set of tools that allowed for hot reloading and also time travel debugging. Very similar to Flux, but a little bit different. The Redux data flow looks more like this. So you have an action. That action gets dispatched to a reducer. The reducer figures out how it's going to update the state in your single store, and then that data then drives your view. The other really important thing about Redux is you only have one store. So most often this ends up being like a global store because you want it to be on top of as many components as you can. So you have this one global store, you slice the state into pieces, and then different components, no matter where they are, can pull from that one store. And React in this way was kind of cool. There was supposed to be a single immutable state tree. So those slices of state were represented in a tree, and it was supposed to be immutable. So state was never modified directly. And that made it a little bit more predictable. It also meant that if you could take snapshots of your state in your application at any given time, if you wanted hot reloading or you had to refresh your page for any reason, you could just rehydrate your entire application with that slice of state, and it would kind of all come back to the way that it was before, which allowed for replayability and, like I said, hot reloading. Redux also has this concept of reducers. So reducers are pure functions that take the actions and decide how to update the state. Because they're pure, this also makes them quite a bit more predictable. And also in Redux, you have these concepts of middleware. So you could have these third-party plugins or even custom middleware before, after the reducers to kind of customize your state flow. And in 2016, Redux very clearly kind of emerges as the leader for React state management. This is a snapshot from the 2016 State of JavaScript survey. And at the time, there were only 3 options, I guess, that you could pick from, which was Redux, MobX, and Relay. And Redux was like very clearly the winner. Not only did it have way more people using it, but it had a massive amount of people who were interested in using it and heard good things about it. And one of the reasons why I personally think that Redux became more popular is because it's 2016 and React has been out for about 3 years, which is plenty enough time for a lot of people to start using it and start trying to use it for really complex applications. And when you have a really complex application, you don't want to be creating your own Flux and state management solution. So a lot of people saw Redux as the answer for a state management solution that would scale for larger applications. And I also think this is why in 2016, Facebook released a statement or a blog post that was titled Mixins Considered Harmful. So essentially Facebook noticed, or the React team noticed, that their complex applications were getting increasingly confusing, difficult to debug. There were parts of their code that people really were didn't want to touch because they weren't really sure what would happen. And they noticed that the main reason for the confusion was React mixins. And mixins had a couple of things that made them not so great to use. So for one, it had really hard to follow dependencies. Like I said, the mixin functions just get spread onto the React component. So in your React component, you call this dot function from mixin. And if you want to find out where that function is coming from, you got to go through all of your mixins and try to figure out which one has a function that has that name on it. It also means that you can't use two mixins that have the same function because they have the same name. They just collide when you spread them onto the React component. That can be really hard if you're using third-party mixins because you can't control what their mixins are supposed to be called. Mixins also can kind of become a confusing web. So like I said, mixins can use mixins and components can use mixins, and as many of them as you want, as long as they don't have name collisions. And pretty soon you have a component and you want like code over here from this mixin, but you don't really want everything else that's in that mixin, but you pull it in anyway because you don't want to like copy and paste the code. And then all of a sudden you have all of this code in your component that you really have no use for. In my perspective, it's very similar to like the banana monkey jungle problem in object-oriented programming. If you've heard of it, it's kind of the same thing. You want the banana, but you end up getting the gorilla holding the banana and the whole jungle because like you just keep pulling in stuff because you want that one thing over there. Also really importantly to mixins is that in 2015, JavaScript ES6 ships, and it initially ships without support for mixins. So React mixins were just built on JavaScript mixins. And if you wanted to use ES6, which I think a lot of people did because it had a lot of improvements in it, you couldn't use mixins with React. So that was kind of like the final sunsetting of mixins right there. So in 2016, when people are trying to get off of mixins, the React team recommended this pattern called higher order components. The pattern existed before, but people a lot of times were using mixins to accomplish the same thing. Higher order components is a code reuse pattern that takes advantage of React component composition, and it's essentially the component equivalent of a higher order function if you're familiar with like functional programming. Essentially, in a higher order component, it's just a function, or it can be a component that takes in a component as like the base, and then it wraps that component with all of the stuff and logic that you want to reuse, and then it returns to you the wrapped component. So now you can have this base component that's reusable, but now you get all of this extra goodies from the higher order component that's also reusable in this like normal React pattern. And when you want to use the higher order component, you basically just call that function, give it your base component, and now you have this new component that you can just render in your React tree as you would normally. Higher order components were great because they supported all types of React components. So like I said, you couldn't use mixins with ES6 classes, but higher order components you could use with React.create class or ES6 classes or functional components. Also, unlike mixins, they have really explicit dependencies. You don't have to go and figure out where the logic is coming from. You just see that your component has been wrapped and that component is being rendered in React. It's pretty easy to follow. Higher order components also really emphasizes this idea of separating your view components versus your logic components. So if you can have a view component that's pretty dumb and it just shows whatever data it's given, and then you have these logic components that don't have any view, they just are kind of like your wrapper logic. You now have reusable logic and reusable views, and you can kind of mix and match all of your components and make them a bit more composable and reusable. Okay, so that brings us to what I see as kind of like the new dawn of React, which is that in 2018, Facebook React released their stable context API. So for a long time, the React team was maintaining what they were calling the experimental context API. And the stable context API was supposed to be a new version of that addressed existing limitations. In your stable context API, you would basically just create a context This is the same context that exists now, by the way. So if this is familiar to you, it's kind of the same API. You create a context and then you create a provider for your context. And now everything underneath that component will have access to the context data by initializing a consumer using the render props API to get out the data, and you can render it into your view. And the stable context solution was also pretty awesome because the unstable context API or the experimental context API, it was a little bit confusing. I don't have a code example for it, but it was kind of similar to Mixins in that stuff just kind of like magically appeared. Like you would have to define it in a couple of really specific places, and then stuff just magically appeared on your components. And it was kind of confusing to figure out where data was coming from. But in the stable context solution, they introduced this like provider consumer interaction where you can very clearly see in your React components, just in the normal render function, where the data is getting provided, which context it belongs to, and where the data is getting consumed for that particular context. The other thing that they improved with the stable context solution or the stable context API was that it updated consistently. So in the experimental one, and the reason why they marked it broken, they literally on their docs would say like, don't use this. This is broken. It's experimental. If you use it in prod, that's on you kind of situation. And the reason really why it was marked as broken is because if you had a component way up here that was providing the context, and then you had a component way down here that was using the context, if there was a component in the middle that had the should component update React lifecycle method, and that component returned false and said like, should component update no, because I'm trying to do some sort of optimization. The component that was way down here that was using the context also just wouldn't update. Like everything from the should component update false down wouldn't get any updates whatsoever, even though you might expect them to. So it was a little bit unpredictable in that way. In the stable context solution, they fixed that. So any component connected to your context will re-render when the context changes, no matter the status of your should component update function. And the other important thing about context is that the equality for the object is checked by reference, not by value. So even if you have all of the same values, but you've created a new object instance, that's going to trigger a re-render for every single component connected to your context. And that's to ensure that things update. And it's also to help promote immutability, but it's just something to keep in mind. We essentially traded inconsistent updates for like always updating no matter what. Also, in 2019, the React team released hooks. So hooks give you access to React features inside of functional components, but you can also write React hooks that are custom to help share stateful code between React components, very similarly to Mixins, but also better. So if you want to define a hook, you just do so like this. You can use any React hooks inside of your hook. You can have access to React state inside of your hooks, and you can just return whatever values you think your components might need. And then when you go to use your hook, in your component, it's really explicit. You just say like, okay, give me the information from this one use fetch search results hook. And then you have that data for your component. And hooks, I think, are pretty awesome. Unlike Mixins, they have very explicit dependencies. So like once again, Mixins were pretty magical. You just called some functions that existed somewhere else and hoped that they worked. But in hooks, you very clearly call them from inside of your component. All of the data and logic lives in the hook itself. And you don't have this like name collision function anymore or name collision problem anymore, because you're just calling functions that have some sort of logic in them. Similarly to Mixins though, hooks can be composed. So you can call hooks from inside of other hooks, and you can call any number of hooks from inside of your component. So hooks are a lot better than Mixins for a lot of these like dependency issues, but it doesn't mean that messy web of dependencies just magically goes away. That's something that we still have to keep in mind with hooks that we can learn kind of back from the Mixin days. Also with hooks, similarly to Mixins, you have access to React state and React lifecycle methods, which is awesome. And in 2019, I started to notice, this was about the time when I joined a different team at Workday, and we were working on a brand new React application. So we got to choose kind of all over again what technology we wanted to use and where. And in 2019, when we were trying to figure out what we were going to do there, I did notice that there was kind of this movement towards a lighter state management solution. Redux had gotten really, really, really popular. And then people were starting to wonder, like, do we actually need Redux for every single application? Is it the right choice for everyone? And I think that's because in 2019, with the addition of context and hooks, React kind of becomes its own state management framework. It always was. You could always have local state. You could always mix local state with Redux state. But until context and hooks, I think the community wasn't sure if that was like a scalable solution. But now with hooks and context, you can essentially create your own Redux with React. So you can have a component and you can put this in a hook. That component can dispatch data to a reducer using the use reducer hook. That reducer can update local state, it can update a context, and maybe your component is then connected to that context, and you've basically got like a DIY Redux situation. There are a couple of differences that Redux still does a little bit differently, but essentially you can build your own. And the really great thing about doing it yourself and using React as a state management solution is, for one, it allows you to freely localize state. And what I mean by that is, in Redux, there was only one store, and it was often at the very top of your application, right? And if you wanted state lower down, you'd have to use a different method. Like you'd have to use React state, and then at the top, you'd have to use Redux state or something like that. If you just use React, you can push the state as far down as you need it to be. So this component way over here doesn't have to be connected to the same store as the component like way over there that doesn't even need the same data. But you're also welcome to have global state, and you can do both of those two things with the exact same functionality, or you can push it down to even just a component, and that component uses the same functionality to manage its state as the global state, as the little piece of state over there. The other really great thing about just using React is that you don't have to have any extra libraries. So this is pretty important if you're trying to keep your bundle size relatively small. Now, there are a lot of state libraries out there, and some of them are bigger than others. Redux is particularly quite large. So if you're trying to keep your bundle size small, if you can go with just React, you're going to save yourself a lot of data there. Also, this one's kind of like an opinion, I think. They're all opinions, I guess. But this one is maybe to be seen. I think that if you use React tools, you'll get first-class maintenance. And what I mean by that is, in 2019, when hooks first shipped, Redux actually hadn't gotten there yet. They hadn't figured out how to support hooks. So if you wanted to use hooks with functional components in your React application, you couldn't use Redux. And so for a lot of people, that me included, in the original application I was working on at Workday, if we wanted to migrate to functional components and we wanted to use hooks, but our entire application was connected to Redux, we were kind of a little bit stuck there, and we had to wait until Redux could catch up, which I think is perfectly fine, honestly, if Redux is the solution for you. But the good thing about going with just React is I don't think that'll happen to you. The React team has kind of set this precedence that they're not gonna up and go in a different direction and leave you kind of stuck in this situation. So that's something that I think might save you in the future. Okay, so it's 2021 somehow. When I first wrote this slide, I just wrote 2020 because my brain hadn't caught up to the fact that we're in 2021 now. But I think that we can learn a lot from all of these years of React. Some things that I try to keep in mind from like the Flux and Mixin days is that unidirectional data flow can help cut down complexity. And I think this is pretty much canon at this point in React. I think everyone kind of has admitted or kind of just decided to go with this unidirectional data flow that React had initially introduced with Flux. We also learned with Mixins that explicit can be easier to maintain sometimes than implicit, and that complex interdependencies between shared code like Mixins can sometimes make components less reusable. And I think there's a lot to learn here from Mixins when we're using hooks, because they're quite similar, a little bit different. A lot of the same kind of pitfalls you can fall into with Mixins still exist in hooks. So these are some things that we can keep in mind when we're designing our applications today. Things I like to remember from the Redux and higher order components days is that immutable state leads to predictability. Again, I think this is pretty much just like an all around best practice at this point, that your React state is supposed to be immutable. We also learned that if you put everything in global state, that can be kind of hard to maintain, and it might not be necessary for every application. It's kind of on an application by application basis. But if you can push the state as far down as you need, you might be able to keep your logic a little bit more localized. Also, from higher order components, I learned that if you keep your logic components separate from your view components, you now have all of these different combos that can help you compose and reuse your different logic and views in React. Also, I think it's just really important to note that, like, it's 2021, it's been a while, React has gone through a couple iterations, but it's not over. Like, we didn't just get contexts and hooks, now we've made it. Like, everything is still evolving. So I like to keep my eye on these sorts of things. We do have hooks and contexts that allow us to keep state as local as possible with an option of global state. Contexts also help reduce prop drilling, which makes it a really great option for passing data down from like a top level to a lower level. But it doesn't mean that everybody is just using React state. Like, there's also a lot of really great third-party options out there that I'm sure you all are pretty aware of a lot of them. The Fluxy ones haven't gone away. Redux and MobX are kind of still kicking it, and they both have a pretty unique value proposition. All of these do, that you might want to check out if you're like starting an application and deciding whether or not what type of state management you should use. There's a couple of really great GraphQL options out there that I haven't gotten a chance to play with myself, but I'd like to. Also, I've been kind of checking out XState these days, which is a state machine kind of based state management system for React. And then, of course, Facebook recently last year released a different state management library called Recoil. Okay, so we started in 2013 with Mixins and Flux, and now it's 2021 and we have hooks and contacts, which are kind of the same, but also different. So React has gone through quite a few of these iterations, but like I noticed from 2013 to 2018, it's very much still the same React underneath. So if we can take some time to go back and look at these past iterations, figure out what the community was struggling with, figure out what the best practices are that came out of those struggles, I think that we can build better React applications today. Cool. That's all I have. My name's Daria. You can find me on Twitter just at Daria Caraway if you want to chat. That's all I got.
Terrific.
That was fantastic. Are you up for taking questions?
Sure.
Yes, lots of virtual claps. Feel free to speak up or throw it in the chat and I'll read it out.
A quick one I had, just especially at the end of your talk there, I'm curious to know more about your experience with the state machine one. I'm totally blanking on it now. You just said the name, but the one you're using at work.
XState?
Yes, XState. Thank you. My team's been looking into using that. And I guess I'm just curious to know, especially for a team that's accustomed to working with Redux, is there anything you'd recommend there, or how strongly do you feel about the library?
Yeah, so to be clear, I'm definitely not using it at work. I've kind of just been like tinkering with it in my spare time. The app that I work on right now, so before I worked on a really, really large application that was using Redux. Right now, I'm working on like a medium to large application that's just using React state management. But I might throw that question over to Will, because I know that his team has been tinkering with using XState to build like more composable components.
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak very well to it directly, but so my team maintains a design system and component library, and we we're leaning into using XState kind of behind the scenes to manage how models update and providing sort of like an interface like utility functions or hooks, I think, to be able to basically we're finding a way to hook into certain ways those state changes happen and when they happen, maybe fire off certain events. So it's pretty deep to actually get into, but there's some neat things about it. XState's I want to say the most popular state state machine library in JavaScript and has been for a while. And there's some interesting ways you can leverage it. I haven't dealt with it myself yet though.
Cool, thank you.
Well, I could definitely appreciate that history lesson. When you showed me Flux, I was like, wow. I remember learning about Flux when that was a thing, and I like forgot it and replaced all of it with just Redux. I forgot about that was just there's subtle differences. But thank you, Daria. That was fantastic.
Yeah, I appreciated the Mixins introduction as well. I didn't start writing React until 2016, and I've heard all these old timers talk about how great Mixins were and the parallels with hooks, like you outlined it. And clearly, hooks is a better implementation anyway. It's a better tool for us to use. So I'm glad they got back around to that style, right? Because there's clearly a lot of fondness for Mixins at the time, but it worked out.
So back to that raffle I mentioned for Quokka and Wallaby, I screwed up the form and there was a couple entries earlier on, and I asked somewhere during the talk to drop in the chat, Wallaby or Quokka, doesn't matter which, I'll enter you for raffle for both. I'm gonna do that in 10 more seconds. So if you haven't entered, just just throw it in the chat. No, Ben. Ben asked if he could get a subscription to Vim, and I thought that was funny. All right, I'm gonna do a random number generator. I've tied everybody to a number. There are a handful of entries, and the first winner of the raffle for the first tool being Wallaby is Brian Dunn. Brian, shoot me your email in chat, but try to message it directly to me. And for Quokka, Jeremy Black. And Jeremy, I'll message you. I know you've already messaged me directly, so I'll get you both those licenses. So thank you for your participation in that little fun exercise. I hope they're useful to you. With that, I would like to invite you all to consider speaking at a future meetup. I know I mentioned this before, but I want to elaborate slightly that you do not need to be a seasoned veteran like Daria. You can be giving your first talk. We are here to help you figure out what topic to give, help you with all the things that go into learning how to speak at your first meetup. We all start with doing one talk that we've never given before at some point. So we're very encouraging that. We have a very supportive community, and we'd love to hear from you, especially if we've never heard from you before. And with that, I'd like to open it up to just hang out and chit chat. We'll shut down the recording in a moment, and feel free to